Propaganda press at work. Michael Martens, the Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung correspondent, questions Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy.
And a short question to the president.
And a brief question for Ukrainian President Zelenskyy. You've already touched on this in part, but can you tell us Europeans what we can do specifically to help you kill more Russians, more Russian soldiers, of course?
More Russian soldiers, of course.
Against the current, straight to the point. First, the leading question. Michael Martens asked a leading question. This is a question that already contains the answer. His leading question therefore says more about Michael Martens' attitude than about the person it was directed at. Michael Martens makes no secret of the fact that he wants to see more Russian soldiers dead. By contrast, Serbian President Vučić said, "As far as killing is concerned, I hope the killing stops." The comparison shows the difference in attitude between humanity and depravity. From a journalistic standpoint, this leading question represents poor craftsmanship and the decay of journalistic ethics. Second, the change of roles. Michael Martens stops being a journalist and becomes an activist. For good journalists, the words of former Tagesthemen anchor Hajo Friedrichs apply. You can recognize a good journalist by the fact that he does not align himself with a cause. Michael Martens aligns himself with a cause, namely the craft of killing. This shows that he is not an observer looking at this war soberly. And apparently Michael Martens does not know what war means. In my view, he is an armchair killer who has never seen what goes on in a war. Because once you have, you become very cautious about such things. When brains are stuck to the ceiling, flies are sitting on them, and the bodies are lying underneath, then all you want is for such things to finally stop. But Michael Martens wants the opposite. He wants Russians to be killed. The mainstream press is apparently in a blood frenzy. Journalists like that, in my view, could also find employment at the Völkischer Beobachter.
Drittens, im Propagandakrieg.
Three, in the propaganda war. Michael Martens later explicitly defended his wording on the platform X. Outside the Barbie world, that's simply how wars are fought. In doing so, he makes himself a party to the war. He behaves like a member of a propaganda company in the Wehrmacht. Their mission was to promote readiness for war and mobilize people in the propaganda war. This turns Martens from an observer into a participant in the war, into a combatant. Because the war in Ukraine is taking place on three levels.
Denn der Krieg in der Ukraine findet auf 3 Ebenen statt. Da ist erstens die militärische Auseinandersetzung an der Front.
First, there is the military confrontation at the front. Second, the global economic war, waged primarily through measures such as sanctions. And third, the propaganda war, cognitive warfare in NATO jargon, aimed at brainwashing one's own population. In this propaganda war, Martens is taking sides.
In diesem Propagandakrieg ergreift Martens Partei. Viertens, Russenhass.
Fourth, hatred of Russians. In my view, Michael Martens is placing himself in the unfortunate German tradition of hatred toward Russians. But hatred of Russians is a form of racism. This Russophobia reached its peak in the last century during the First and Second World Wars, and also during the Cold War. Martens shows here that he has learned nothing from the history of the 20th century. I'm against holding families responsible, but in this, he follows in the tradition of his grandfather, Hans Hermann Martens, a member of the Nazi Party who worked as an officer on the Wehrmacht command staff and served as a military judge. In 1945, he continued working as a lawyer. This hatred of Russians is tied to a reversal of guilt. One's own responsibility can finally be ignored, and the Russians can be assigned sole responsibility for the war in Ukraine. But on closer inspection, that is wrong, and it conceals NATO's shared responsibility.
die Mitverantwortung der NATO. 5. Verstoß gegen das Grundgesetz.
Fifth, a violation of the basic law. In Michael Martens' question and its implication, I see a violation of the German basic law. Article 26 states, actions that are intended and capable of disturbing peaceful relations among nations, especially preparing for a war of aggression, are unconstitutional. They are to be made punishable by law. In my view, Martens' statement is capable of disturbing peaceful relations among nations. In my eyes, this is contempt for humanity and incitement of the people in journalistic guise. Nowhere in the basic law does it say that we must provide military aid to Ukraine. Article 24 says that, in order to preserve peace, the federal government may join a system of mutual collective security. The point is to preserve peace, not to prolong a war.
Die Verlängerung eines Krieges. 6. Rechtliche Folgenlosigkeit. Dass sich kein Staatsanwalt rühren.
Legal impunity. The fact that no prosecutor takes action shows that public prosecutors' offices are also merely authorities bound by directives, and that Germany once again has terrible jurists today. As the poet Rolf Hochhuth once wrote about Filbinger, the former naval judge and later minister-president of Baden-Württemberg, who continued to hand down death sentences after the capitulation on May 8, 1945. Today, I believe, neither journalists nor jurists are, for the most part, willing or able to defend the constitutional order. There are hardly any patriots of the Constitution left in either profession. This, too, shows how far Germany has fallen by now. Above all, though, it shows the failure of the intellectuals who have made themselves into the henchmen of the warmongers.
Die sich zu Handlangern der Kriegstreiber machen. 7. Das Schweigen der Propagandapresse.
7th, the silence of the propaganda press. Deafening silence across almost all mainstream media outlets. No outcry. But this is where the saying applies. Those who remain silent consent. This shows that the entire mainstream press has submitted to NATO propaganda. It has gone from informing the public to spreading propaganda. If we had functioning media, we wouldn't have to be talking about being ready for war. The press has become the willing enforcer of the power elites. Just try the reverse test. A campaign of denunciation was launched against me because I conducted research in the war zone on the Russian side and reported on the referendums in the fall of 2022.
Und über die Referenden im Herbst 2022 berichtet habe. Ich hätte die russische Besatzung legitimiert.
I supposedly legitimized the Russian occupation. That's why 2 of my teaching assignments were terminated, at Kiel University and at the private University of Communication and Economics in Berlin. This shows the full hypocrisy and double standards of the mainstream media. The press itself has become a driver of war. Militaristic and anti-democratic thinking does not begin with the intellectually impaired, but in newsrooms and in academia.
Sondern in Redaktionen und in Akademien. 8. Die Stellungnahme der Frankfurter Allgemeinen Zeitung.
8. The statement by the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. The FAZ took 4 days to issue a statement. The paper had its corporate communications department explain that the question had been phrased ambiguously. The editor-in-chief and the publishers offered no explanation themselves. It is supposedly not the editorial position of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung that as many Russian soldiers as possible should be killed. This is what I would say. The question was by no means ambiguous, and a reprimand would look different. After all, the editorial staff put the article in the paper without removing the question. This is called implied consent. That sheds light on the editorial climate of opinion at the FAZ. Here too I say, those who remain silent agree. The FAZ statement is an outrage, and it shows how far the paper has sunk by now. The FAZ has become NATO's media agent.
Ist zum publizistischen Agenten der NATO geworden. 9. Historische Amnesie.
9. Historical amnesia. All of this weighs even more heavily against the backdrop of German-Russian history. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union from 1941 to 1945 was not just another war. It was a war of annihilation and enslavement. in which around 27 million Soviet people were killed. Even today, there are hardly any families in Russia and the successor states of the Soviet Union that did not lose victims in that war. Martens seems to have forgotten that. I suspect he wasn't interested in it either.
Ich vermute, es hat ihn auch nicht interessiert. Unterschlagen wird im medialen Mainstream auch.
What the mainstream media also leaves out is that NATO's eastward expansion, contrary to assurances that had been given, the arming of Ukraine, the 12 CIA stations in eastern Ukraine, and the rejection of Russia's negotiating proposals in January 2022 were what provoked the Russian invasion in the first place. It was the West that boycotted the Istanbul peace agreement already negotiated in the spring of 2022. It was the West that slammed shut the door opened at the meeting between Presidents Trump and Putin in Anchorage in August 2025. And it was the West that did not accept Russia's offer of a non-aggression pact with NATO. Weakening Russia. That has been the long-planned strategy of the United States, as you can read, for example, in the papers of the RAND Corporation, an important think tank. That's how propaganda media operate, lies by omission. Of course, that doesn't justify anything, but the war in Ukraine is anything but an unprovoked war of aggression. What is cowardly and cynical about Martens' position is that he wants young Ukrainians led to the slaughterhouse instead of going to the front himself. Killing Russians. That is also a metaphor for everything that is currently going wrong in Europe and the collective West, a perverse vision of Western dominance through the subjugation of Russia. But history shows that those who call for Russians to be killed quickly realize that Russia defends itself and then kills those who pose an existential threat to Russia.
Zehntens. Reaktionen in Russland. Die Äußerung des FAZ-Korrespondenten Michael Martens hat auch
The remarks by FAZ correspondent Michael Martens are also affecting public opinion in Russia. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova placed Martens in the tradition of German fascism. She said the incident showed the continuity of brown ideology, which persists in parts of Germany's media landscape. She accused the West of clinical Russophobia. Martens' wording about how to help kill Russians, she said, was not a journalistic mistake, but the slogan of the so-called global elite. 10. Reactions in Russia. In Russia, remarks like these strengthen those forces that, unlike President Putin, want to escalate more quickly and more harshly in the war in Ukraine and in the war with NATO. They advocate a tougher response against Ukraine, as is already happening. In response to the 40 days of drone attacks on the Russian hinterland, Russian airstrikes have crippled Ukrainian ports and turned the country into a landlocked state that is no longer economically viable. Even today, Ukraine is a failed state that has to drive its own citizens to the front through forced conscription. People like Martens now really seem to want to wage the proxy war between NATO and Russia down to the last Ukrainian. All of this will further strain the relationship between Russia and Germany, which is already irreparably damaged for many decades to come. This is not helpful for an industrial nation in decline like Germany, because without low-cost Russian energy, we can no longer produce competitively. You get the impression that people like Martens are driven by a death wish, willing to surrender their country and themselves to ruin. Germany could still pay a high price for people like Martens and their warmongering. 11. A wake-up call to readers. Readers should realize that propaganda outlets like the FAZ are among the worst warmongers. Their apparent goal is to lead 85 million people into a new war with Russia. Maybe they should consider reviewing their information diet. After all, you don't eat spoiled food, you throw it away. So perhaps they should consider canceling warmongering media and getting their information from reputable publications. And I say to the users, those responsible for the disaster are not only the ones who cause it, but also those who do not want to prevent it. And I say to Mr. Martens, if you call for Russians to be killed, then go to the Eastern Front yourself.
Wenn Sie dazu aufrufen, Russen zu töten, dann gehen Sie selber an die Ostfront.